Hello, and welcome to a brand new day of free-to-play here on Magic the Gathering Arena. Get the dish on the latest with me, Lord Rumfish. We are doing the Deckbuilding Toolbox series. If you missed Colorless and Lands, that was the video just before this one. Now we're on Mono White. And this set is complicated to talk about the monocolors, because if there is a disguise creature that can flip up for hybrid colors of mana, that counts as a monocolored creature that you can play. Right? You can play it for its disguise cost, flip it up for its disguise cost, and you can run it in a monocolor deck. There are also some hybrid color split cards, which means you can run one or both sides of those in a monocolor deck. So we're going to have to look at those cards when we do our monocolor section. I'm going to try to go fast here as much as I can, so bear with me if I don't go into quite as much detail as I did in the Colorless and Land section. Alright, Case of the Uneaten Feast. So this one, whenever a creature ETBs, you gain 1 life. And then you solve this case if you've gained 5 or more life this turn. And you can sacrifice the case, and you can cast creatures from your graveyard until end of turn. Just, like a Yawgmoth's Will kind of effect. This is very powerful. Now, you only really play it in a life gain deck, but in that deck, this is a card you probably want, some number of. Outside of the life gain deck, probably no real application. So, I would say this is a narrow card and not really a toolbox card. Forum Familiar. The only reason I'm going to craft one of these is for completionist's sake. I don't think it's actually very good. This is a 1/1 cat, right? So if you just play it on its front face, it's just a 1/1 white cat for 1. No real relevant creature types or anything, no keywords. If you disguise it as a, 2/2 ward for 3, which is not a great rate in Constructed, then when you turn it face up for 2 mana, you return another target permanent you control to its owner's hand. That's not a May ability. You must do it. And put a +1/+1 counter on the Forum Familiar. It's interesting that when you can save your own permanents this way, that it lets you bounce lands. Right? I'm used to seeing a lot of cards like this that say non-land permanent, but if you're bouncing your own things, apparently it's okay to bounce lands. That's about the only part of this card I find interesting, and I think it's just not got the chops for Constructed. Crovad Haunch. This card's a little bit interesting and limited. It's a fine piece of equipment, gives a +2 power boost, can move it around for 2 mana, you can sack it to gain 3 life as a food. You can also, when it's put in a graveyard, you can pay an extra 2 mana and get 2 dogs. All of that is interesting. And if there's an outside possibility that if you can directly fetch, artifacts or food or equipment right from your library or your graveyard straight to the battlefield, maybe there's some world where this could see some Constructed play. But I find it doubtful. It's mana intensive to use the card. It only costs 2 to do everything the card does. Right? It's 2 to sack it for food, it's 2 to make the 2 dog tokens, it's 2 to equip, but all those 2s add up. I don't think it gets there, but it's got an outside chance. Nov Inspector is great. This is a functional reprint of Thraben Inspector, reflavored because Thraben is not in Ravnica. Just a 1/2 for 1, white. It's a human, which is relevant. There could be a detective deck. Probably not, but there could be. You get to investigate. So this replaces itself with a clue. This is a good card in aggressive decks. It's notably seeing play alongside red, where you target your own artifact and blow it up and make 3 goblins. It's good for aggressive starts in that deck. It's pretty good in general. And I would argue this is not bad in mid-range and control. It gives you an early blocker that you can chump with, maybe even trade with, and you get a clue to cycle itself, basically. Draw you a card, helps you hit your land drops, helps you get to your game plan. Which, honestly, if you're playing like mono-white mid-range or control, you probably want to run this there too. So this card kind of checks all the boxes. Artifact synergies, everything, it's great. Wrench. Pretty strong in limited. I would say probably doesn't get there in constructed, unless constructed has some kind of an eggs deck, where you're pulling back equipment from the graveyard that are like the clue equipment to sack them to draw cards. Tezzeret could reduce the cost on this. There's also a blue rare in the new set that's 2/3. It makes clues when you play artifacts, and it reduces the activated ability on artifacts by 1, but not to less than 1 mana. So there's an outside possibility that these equipment could see play in some kind of deck. But probably not for its like normal use that you see in limited, where you just like equip it for +1/+1 in vigilance and pay 3 and tap a creature. That's not what you would be doing most of the time in constructed, just on rare occasion. If you're running this in a deck, it's probably because you're cheating it into play, or you've got some kind of a combo wheel spinning. You've reduced the cost of equipping and sacrificing it and stuff. Assemble the Players. A lot of people have talked about this card. I think it's kind of forgettable. We have a 2-mana enchantment. You can look at the top card of your library, which has some value to know what's coming. Once each turn, you may cast a creature spell with power 2 or less from the top of your library. If you had a deck that was full of flash creatures, and there is like Errant and Giada, which can let you play creatures with flying or flash off the top of your library. So if you're doing that deck, I mean, for one thing, Errant and Giada does the same thing that this card would be doing in that deck, so you don't need this card in that deck. But if you had flash creatures, you could play this on the opponent's turn as well, by playing flash creatures off your library. Mostly, it's probably okay in a deck that is approaching 30 creatures or more. As long as about half the hits off the top of your library are creatures with power 2 or less, then you're gonna get pretty good value off of this, even though it's only once a turn. Still, it seems like an awkward card that is maybe better served by other things we already have in Standard. Right, there's an Angel that draws you a card when you play a creature with power 2 or less. There's an enchantment that draws you a card when you play a creature with like converted mana cost 3 or less, something like that. There's a lot of other ways of doing this effect, and I think this one is maybe not worth it. Auspicious Arrival. This is a combat trick. I'm going to say this is pretty much a limited card. It takes the very best of the best combat tricks to see play in Standard. Usually that means you have to give a creature hexproof or indestructible. Everything else pretty much doesn't cut the mustard. Call a Surprise Witness. There's a 1-mana version of this card in white that does see play in a deck, but it doesn't need copies of this. The 1-mana card serves that deck just fine. So, unless you're on a budget or you're a new player, you're probably not going to need this card to do that effect. Case of the Gateway Express. This one's pretty good. This deals 1 damage to a creature in a strange way. Each creature you control deals 1 damage to the target. I was thinking This case could be useful with lifelinkers or death touchers. I haven't seen anyone pair it up in that way yet. But it would be a sneaky way to ensure that the thing dies with death touch. It would be a sneaky way to gain life with lifelink. Just a thought. And all you have to do is attack with 3 or more creatures, and you get a +1 power boost for the rest of the game. Which is pretty good. Probably good enough to be playing it in Standard. Case of the Pilfered Proof, this is all about detectives. So, if the detective deck is going to be a thing, this might go in that deck because it's going to put +1 counters on every detective that ETBs and every detective that turns face up. So at the very least, you've got a sort of ongoing Anthem effect that just, puts out counters on all your detectives. And then if you have 3 or more detectives, this gives you extra clues whenever tokens are generated. And that's nice too. I really don't know if Detectives has anything close to the chops to be a deck in Standard, so I would say don't craft it. Doorkeeper Thrall is a weird one. So this is kind of like a Hushbringer. So we have a 1/2 flyer for 2 mana. It has flash, so you can sneak this out in response to an ETB trigger of an artifact or creature to counter it when the opponent's not even expecting it. And that's kind of cute. Probably could genuinely trip up the opponent quite a bit. But this is a symmetrical effect. This also turns off your artifacts and creatures' ETBs. You can break that symmetry, of course, by building your deck in such a way that you don't use artifacts and creatures with ETB triggers, but that limits you in what you can do with your deck. Can it go in a wide variety of decks? Maybe. You could probably do some kind of funky tempo build. It does have flash. So I could see like a blue-white flash deck. There's also a blue creature that can come down and like counter an activated or triggered ability. That's the beginnings of a strange like tempo flash deck right there. Where you can pressure the opponent with flash creatures, keep your mana open on their turn, you can counter their board sweepers and stuff. I could imagine that deck. I don't know if there's a wide variety of different builds that would use Doorkeeper Thrall. Maybe. There's some hoops to jump through with this one, though, for sure. Market Watch Phantom. Okay, let's say this was a 2/2 for 2 that just had flying. Right? Let's just say this was a Spirit Detective that was a 2/2 with flying for 2. Right? Just all the time. Would that be good enough for Standard? And I'm inclined to say no. Lets you block some like 1/1 flying tokens like bats and other things. At that point, for the theoretical card we're talking about, right, a 2/2 flyer is different than a 2/1 flyer. We have some 2/1 flyers for 2 already. But even if this card was that card, I don't know if it would make it. So, being this, where it only triggers some of the time, I'm pretty sure this is just a limited card. It is a beating in limited, though. Neighborhood Guardian. This one's kind of interesting. So, you got a 2/2 for 2 unicorn. No relevant creature types, but whenever another creature with power 2 or less ETBs under your control, target creature you control, which can be itself, gets +1/+1 until end of turn. And that could be a lot, especially if you're going wide, making a token deck. This could be a lot of power toughness boosts, and you get to pick where every single +1 goes. I don't know if that makes it good enough for Constructed, but I think this is one of those cards that's borderline. I think it's borderline, maybe close to good enough. I'm going to go ahead and craft one just to fill out my collection here. Not on my watch, I'll go ahead and craft one of these. This is probably good enough to run for a control deck. You know, it forces you into a reactive position. There have been times in my white control deck where I have run the one that can destroy an attacking creature, or you can pay 6 mana to just destroy any target creature. And there have been lots of times where I have paid the 6 mana, you know, to just like blow up a Sholdred or a whatever on the other side of the battlefield. Something that's threatening me or in my way, that I have the open mana to deal with, and that I want gone. So there will be times when this card is really awkward. But that being said, a 2 mana exile at instant speed, this is probably playable. It's probably fine. Perimeter Enforcer, again, this is maybe for a detective deck. I'm not even certain about that. Possibly because it's a flying lifelinker. Sanctuary Wall, this one, probably there's not a like Toughness Matters Defender deck in Standard that actually wants this wall. There are some other creatures with high toughness already in the format. I don't know that this particular wall would make it into a wall deck. 3 is a lot to tap something. You've got the option to stun it and stun the wall, which is a little interesting, but eh. Seasoned Consultant. I think if you were pretty early in your Magic career, and you're cobbling together an aggressive deck with a small collection, this card will do you just fine. There are ways to get tokens and speed onto the battlefield, you know, with the way you build your constructed deck, to where a lot of the time this can attack as a 3/3 for 2. And that's pretty good. I'll tell you straight up firsthand that 3/3s for 2 are good enough to see play. They are. Whether or not that's what your deck can do, or if you have the mana to cast them, or if that's what your deck wants, you know, whatever. 3/3s for 2 are good enough. So this card could be good enough for you if you're a new player with a small collection. If you're an established player with a large collection, you will have cards that overshadow the power of this one. 10th District Hero. This looks playable to me. So it wasn't that long ago in Standard that 2/3s for 2 were pretty playable cards. They were, you know, pretty good stop signs against aggro. Get into some good fisticuffs in the early part of the game, especially if you're up against like mono white. Then getting down some like 2/3s and 3/4s and stuff can be pretty good there. Unfortunately, red is getting a lot of technology to just power through blockers right now. It's becoming harder and harder to challenge mono red on the battlefield, but this card can come down on 2, and it's not hard at all to collect Evidence 2 and pay 2 mana to make this a 4/4 with Vigilance. And it's not that deep of a mana sink and not that much of a constraint to be able to do that. Now, jumping from there to a 3 mana activation where you collect Evidence 4, that's a bit more of a stretch. But you do get a good payoff. At that point, this becomes a 5/5, and other creatures have Indestructible, which means that this is the removal magnet at that point. The opponent has to kill this thing first to get rid of the Indestructible before they can deal with all your other stuff. I think this card is fine, and I think this card's probably playable. It's just that white is a wash in different rare and mythic 2-drops at this point. To where, even though I think this card's probably just, good enough, playable, I don't think that's enough to make it one of the best of the best. I don't think it makes it into like the top tier list anymore. So again, if you are building your collection and you have some copies of this card, I think it will serve you well. And once you have an extremely filled out collection, maybe at some point the copies of this start cycling out of your deck. And that's fine too. Unyielding Gatekeeper. This card is interesting. It's one of the few disguised creatures that looks like it could possibly have what it takes to get into standard play. And I'm not sure that it gets there. So it's kind of a Brutal Cathar type of card, but actually the one I like to compare this to. There was a spirit, an apparition, which exiled something of the opponents with mana value 4 or less. It cost 2 white and a colorless. And that card exiled forever. If they got rid of your creature, eventually they got back a blue illusion that had power and toughness equal to the converted mana cost of the thing it had taken. They never get the original card back. This reminds me more of that card than it does of Brutal Cathar. Getting rid of that thing forever is more interesting to me. You never give them the card back. So you have to play this somehow, some way face down. You could ramp extra mana, you could attack with a little red creature that makes, your morph creatures cheaper. Disguise, morph, disguise, whatever. Somehow, some way, you gotta get it face down. And then later you can pay 2, turn it face up at instant speed, exile any other non-land permanent. That's powerful. And if you controlled that permanent, then you flicker it. You return it to the battlefield tapped. That doesn't let you do a surprise block, but it can do a lot of other neat tricks with ETB triggers and etc. Otherwise, if it was something you didn't control, then they get a 2/2 white and blue detective creature token. So yeah, this card reminds me a lot of that apparition. That would exile something forever, and then they would get like a blue illusion token back. This one can also protect your own things, which is a way it's different than that card. Unfortunately, this card also costs more mana. You do have the option to play it as an Elephant Cleric 3/2 on turn 2, which is okay. If what you really need to do is just pressure the opponent, you could do worse than getting down a 3-power creature on turn 2. It's something. I think it's far, far better in its face-down mode. And I don't know that this gets there with aggro. I think this card is begging for a mid-range deck. And I know it's a little foreign, the idea of a white mid-range deck. But basically you can do something like a mid-rangey, control-y kind of build where you do a lot of card advantage, card draw, finding yourself planes, gaining some life, sweeping the board, and then you set up with these kind of mid-rangey plays that just generate a lot of value for you over the course of the game. This could go into that kind of deck brilliantly. I don't know if that kind of deck survives in this standard right now, but I like this card. I like what it's doing. Casefile Auditor. This is a 1/4 for 3 human detective. When it ETBs, and whenever you solve a case, you look at the top 6 cards of your library, you reveal an enchantment. From among them, put it in your hand, the rest go on the bottom in a random order. And you can spend mana as though it were mana of any color to cast case spells. I don't know, like this last sentence, I don't know if it needed to be on this card. are you going to depend on getting this card onto the battlefield so you can play your 5-color case deck? I don't think so. I think they could have just shortened the text box on this card. But anyway. Long and the short of it is, the floor of this card is a 1/4 that gets you an enchantment out of your top 6. As long as you've got a critical mass of enchantments, you're going to hit something. That's kind of cool. There is a green-white enchantments deck in Standard. Now, I don't know that it wants this thing. This is a 3-mana card that they can't reduce the mana cost on. So even though it would give them a battlefield presence and draw them a card, I don't know if that does enough for the green-white enchantment deck. The green-white enchantment deck is less of a... I mean, it can do the mid-range slogfest kind of thing, but really it loves to get down an aggressive start and power you out of the game. This card doesn't go with that game plan. Now, it could go with some other enchantment deck game plan where you're playing a longer strategy. Maybe some kind of weird, like, 5-color enchantments deck. We still have, the 5-color enchantment from Kamigawa Neon Dynasty. That's the saga that does all the interesting things. Maybe this would go into that kind of deck. I think it's got potential. I think there are decks you could try to build with this card. And it's just an uncommon. Delny, a lot of people are talking about this card. So this one doubles up the triggers of your power 2 or less creatures. Not just enters the battlefield, but any ability that triggers. So that could be an on-attack trigger, a life gain trigger. It could be a lot of different things. It also makes creatures you control with power 2 or less not able to be blocked by creatures with power 3 or greater. Which only really works if you're not pumping up your team too far. If you pump up the team too much, then you don't get that effect. Otherwise, this is a 2/2 for 3. I don't like cards like this personally. This feels like it's a do-nothing setup card. Now, you could wait. You could hold this card in your hand and wait until turn 4 or 5 until you can 1/2 punch, right? To where you're pretty sure, more likely, that you might get triggers off of Delny before it just eats a removal spell. I'm sure it can do amazing things, but I'm not convinced. Probably there are a lot of different ways to build a Delny deck, though. So I will say, in terms of deck building potential, it's there. It's a functional, useful tool. It could go into a wide variety of different ideas. So even though I don't like it that much, maybe you do. And I think this could be a good tool for your toolbox if you like this kind of effect. Due Diligence, this thing can be a beating in Limited. In Standard, it comes down and kind of puts out like 4 power worth of Vigilant Haste for 3 mana. If you could catch the opponent tapped out with a certain kind of aggressive start, I could almost imagine a card like this doing work in Standard. But I wouldn't hold my breath. Inside Source. Again, the white deck, if you thought the 2-drops were pretty crowded in white, the 3-drops are also phenomenal. They're all just fighting for space at the 3-drop spot. Now, if there's a detective deck, maybe this is good enough to go in there, because it makes a detective token. It also can pump up your other detectives. Also gives you just like a chump block, fodder, human citizen. It's not impossible that this could see standard play. You know, it's one of those kind of cards that's on the cusp of playability. It probably doesn't quite get there. There are a number of other vaguely similar cards to this that also haven't gotten there. We'll see. Makeshift binding. So this just exiles a creature until the binding leaves the table. You also gain 2 life. This is a little bit slow. Right, we've got some good 2 mana removal in white. There's the one that enchants a basic land. Ossification. Then there's the ley line? The one that reduces its cost based on your number of basic lands. That can get to be an instant speed 1 mana white removal enchantment. And it hits non-land permanents, I believe. This one just hits creatures. I will say with the 2 life gain, for a new player, this could actually be a pretty reasonable inclusion in your deck to blunt a start from like a red aggressive deck or a red-green deck or whatever. You take their best thing off the board. The 2 life gain also helps to offset, like the 3 mana cost of this card. It's not nothing, and if you were playing a life gain deck anyway, maybe it could synergize with what your deck's doing. So I'd say there's maybe an outside chance you could try to make this do something, especially if you got a smaller collection. Make your move is fine. It costs 3 mana. That's its only real downside here. You will find artifacts and enchantments to blow up. You also will find creatures with power 4 or greater to blow up. There's just a lot of those things running around in Standard. But this card costing 3 mana, even though it's at instant speed, which is good, there are some other similar effects that we have in white. Some of them are rares, some of them aren't, that are just much cheaper, or more flexible in some way. So, again, small collection, this will do good work for you. As your collection fills out, you'll probably cut these at some point. Wojek Investigator. This is a 2/4 Angel Detective for 3. It's got Flying and Vigilance. Good sized body. It's too big to cut down. At the beginning of your upkeep, you investigate once for each opponent who has more cards in hand than you. If you want a real shot at triggering the upkeep trigger on this, then you need an aggressive deck. You need to get the stuff out of your hand. So you need 1-drops and 2-drops and stuff. And you don't want to clog up on too many 3s and 4s. Now, if you're doing a deck that's that aggressive, how many times are you going to spare your mana on clues rather than just, like, killing the opponent? I don't know. This could be another, like, mid-range piece of some kind, but if you're not storming your hand onto the battlefield, there's a lot less certainty about whether or not you're going to get any clues off of this. And it has to survive all the way back to your upkeep. I don't think this card is bad. I just think there are a lot of other cards that kind of have more immediate impact or otherwise outshine this card in some way. Aurelia's Vindicator. So this is an interesting card, but the disguise cost is pretty pricey. In order to flip this up and actually exile anything, you need at least 5 mana. Now, you can use it to regrow like creatures from your graveyard. back to your hand once this leaves the battlefield. And that's interesting. Kind of unusual. Slow card advantage thing that you could do with this. You can, of course, just slam this for 4 mana as a Ward 2 Flying Lifelinker with 4 power. Yeah, maybe there are some board states where that's a good option to race, or it trades with something in combat and the life gain helps offset the aggressive start of the opponent. Again, I don't think this card's terrible, but I feel like white has so many interesting tools in the toolbox, I don't know if you need this one. But the part where you can regrow your stuff out of the graveyard is interesting to me. And if you exile the opponent's things off the battlefield, they get bounced back to their hand when this dies. So, I mean, it's not the worst. It's a flexible tool. I just think there might be better tools. Griffknot Tracker, this is okay and limited. Doesn't really have the chops for constructed. It doesn't do enough to the board. It doesn't survive enough removal for having cost 4 mana. Just doesn't get there. Karlov Watchdog, I could almost see this as like a 1 or 2 of in a constructed deck that's going wide. You just drop this and, you attack with 3 or more things, and all your creatures get this +1 boost from the Watchdog. But I still don't think it's as good as a bunch of other options for 4 mana. Oh, and the whole permanence, your opponent's control can't turn face up on your turn. I don't know that much of anyone's going to be playing morph creatures in Standard anyway. So, Museum Nightwatch. This is, again, really solid and limited, and a bit too costly for constructed. It's nice that when this dies that you get a replacement 2/2, but it just costs too much mana for Standard. No Witnesses. This is playable. You've got your choice of different sweepers in the format. I think one of the sweepers people have forgotten about a bit is Vanquish the Horde. There are some ridiculous starts that aggressive decks have been doing recently in Standard. Just going absurdly wide with tokens, and then, tapping those tokens to convoke out a 4/4 that finds them more cards, and I think Vanquish the Horde is possibly the sweeper of choice. I think this thing might be the tech against some of the decks that you're seeing. This can reduce its cost against, an aggressive start from a white deck with Thalia and whatnot. Usually the way that deck tries to tax you out of the game is just a combination of Thalia and Ward 1 being given out to the humans and such. But storming all those creatures onto the board just makes your Vanquish the Horde cheaper and cheaper to the point that you can cast it even through a Thalia. So if you're looking for some anti-aggro tech, I think this is it right here, Vanquish the Horde. You could play it for less than the 4 mana sweepers. All that being said, this card is fine and it will serve you well. On the job, there's a lot of ways to accomplish this effect, including at potentially cheaper mana costs if you go into red or other colors. Very forgettable. Absolving Lamassu. If for some reason suspected, if there's some deck where suspected creatures become very important in Standard, then this is like a shut-off valve that just removes all suspicion. This can also do a couple of funny things, like there's a black rare creature that's indestructible that is suspected when it comes down. There's also the black skeleton, right? And its enchantment says if you control no suspected skeletons, it solves and you can demonic tutor. If you pair those black cards with this absolving Lamassu, it can unsuspect them, and now your indestructible creature can block, and the opponent will lose life for how much damage that thing takes. And you won't have any suspected skeletons, so you can demonic tutor with the enchantment. That could be cute. So maybe there's like exactly one deck. Maybe there's exactly one that absolving Lamassu could go into. I don't think it goes in a wide variety, though. And then when this thing dies, you gain 3 life, which is a, nice little payback. And you can suspect a creature the opponent controls. You don't have to. So if you'd like something of theirs not to be able to block, you can do that. If you don't want them to gain menace, you don't have to. It's not great, but you could do something proactive with unsuspecting your own stuff. Essence of Antiquity. Most interesting thing about this card is it has 10 toughness. And there might, maybe, be a Toughness Matters deck kicking around somewhere in the dregs of Standard. Possibly, this card could make it in. I don't know if white's going to be in that deck. I don't know if this card makes it in even if white is in the deck. But it's an option. Also, if you are making a deck like that, it should be able to stall an aggressive start with your high toughness creatures. So maybe you would have time to actually play this face down, and then flip it up for hexproof and untap your whole board. And that could really blow out, like, an aggro mid-range kind of opponent on an attack step. The hexproof could also just, blow out a removal spell or whatever. I don't think this thing is great, but if you're making it deal damage equal to its toughness, then maybe there's exactly one deck that might possibly want it. I don't think it's a great tool for the toolbox. Unless you want to build that deck. Hazda Vigilante. This card is fine in Limited. I think it's just not quite strong enough for Constructed. Like if you played it in Constructed, it would do stuff, right? The moment it enters the battlefield, it pumps up one of your 2 power or less guys. And if that's, like a 2-3 lifelinker or something, you've had a relevant impact on the board, even if this thing never gets to attack. But for 5 mana, it's just not quite enough in Standard. Standard has a pretty high bar for what you need to do as a 5-drop these days. So even though this thing's alright, I don't think it's alright enough. Defenestrated Phantom. The rate on this card is for Limited. It is too pricey to see play in Standard. Alright, now we're talking about hybrid cost cards. So, Granite Witness you cannot play on its front face in a mono-white deck, but you can play it face down and then flip it up. Most of these are just going to be limited playable, and this one is no different. Maybe if a detective deck has something that it's doing, but not anywhere else, really. Sanguine Savior's a little bit interesting in a life gain deck. And that deck might be white-black anyway, but just talking about mono-white here, you can play this face down, flip it up, and now you've potentially got 2 things attacking with lifelink that are giving you triggers to grow your creatures to get more +1 counters, maybe make an angel at end of turn, all of that stuff. I don't think this is good enough to see play in that deck, but if you had a small collection, I think it could be an enabling card. Dogwalker almost gets there. In a red-white deck, it really almost gets there, just not quite. Red-white has so many excellent 2-drops already. 3/1 Vigilance is nothing to sneeze at. It is a scary creature that can still block for you and put the pressure on. Playing it face down, flipping it up for 2 white. You get 2 tapped dogs. They can't block that turn, but if you do it at the end of the opponent's turn, you can have, from out of nowhere, 5 power worth of stuff coming in. Probably more in constructed. You're probably doing something to pump up those tokens to really push the damage through in a go-wide strategy. I think this card is close to being playable. Not quite. It's not quite there. I think just the 3 mana cost on all the disguise things is just a bridge too far. If it weren't for that, I think this one would be awfully close to seeing play. It's at least not too embarrassing. Crowd Control Warden is super expensive. It can become stupidly big. That is its one great selling point, is if you have gone wide and you get to 5 mana and flip this thing up, you've got 1,000,000 tokens, then, much like the Bunnicorn, this thing will be enormous. The Bunnicorn, however, only costs 2. This thing costs 3 to get down and then 5 to flip up. Of course, the Bunnicorn is a rare. This is, a budget option. If you could get this thing trample, or unblockable, or flying, something like that, then it could be something that won you the game. There's like a dim outside possibility that this could see standard play, especially for a new player with a small collection. So bear it in mind. White can do the push side of push-pull. There are enough good removal spells in white at 2 mana, 1, 2, and 3 mana, that I don't think you need a sorcery speed 2 mana spell that destroys a tapped creature. In fact, I think there is a 1 mana spell that destroys a tapped creature. Here it is, Runic Shot. So this spell is from Dominaria United, and you don't have to pay the blue kicker. You can just pay 1 white, destroy target tapped creature. It is cheaper, and the difference between 1 mana and 2 mana is an enormous difference, right? A difference like being able to target Thalia when you're mana screwed, that kind of thing. Runic Shot is a halfway reasonable card, just because it's 1 mana. Now, something that's hurt Runic Shot during its time in Standard is the existence of the Wandering Emperor. Just by virtue of the Wandering Emperor being in the format, people have valued Vigilance more. And it's kind of like woven its way into the format in a kind of a, creeping sensation sort of way, where, there's just sort of in the back of people's minds, if you can have a choice between a Vigilance and a non-Vigilance creature, they'll say, oh, maybe I should take the Vigilance creature. It's good against the Wandering Emperor. And that makes Runic Shot worse. This is still a good card, though, and it's better than the one we're just looking at if you can't cast the 6 mana side. Right, if you can't cast Pull, then Push is totally overshadowed by Runic Shot, even if you don't have the blue kicker. White can cast Desist all by itself, destroy all artifacts and enchantments. And I think we're in a standard where that's just about good enough to see play. It's real close. There are all kinds of times where I very gladly hit my farewell and choose all the modes on it, and the opponent is wiped out. They can have, big piles of artifacts, big piles of enchantments, or both. The only problem with this compared to Farewell, of course, is it doesn't get rid of creatures or graveyards. And this is a symmetrical, always destroys artifacts and enchantments effect. You don't get to pick and choose. So it will always destroy your own artifacts and enchantments, and that hurts. and it's a deck building consideration. And that means I don't know that you run Desist as a naturalized sweeper. Unless you're pretty sure you've got no artifacts or enchantments you couldn't stand to just lose. If they all did what they needed to when they entered the battlefield, that kind of thing, then sure. I don't think it quite sees play just as the mode of Desist. White can run both sides of Fuss and Bother. So on the side of Fuss, as long as you don't have Thalia taxing you, then putting a +1 counter on each attacking creature, that gives you a pretty good Alpha Strike kind of damage the turn that you played it. And if they don't sweep the board, it's a permanent benefit that lasts into the next turn. Those counters stick around. That could be a big deal. It's a little bit difficult to imagine the same deck that wants to play Fuss would also be the same deck that wants to play Bother. However, let me just paint a scenario for you. Let's say you've got a deck that's low to the ground, usually plays Fuss, gets the +1 counters and uses the extra damage to win the game. But you've gotten into a slog against a control player or mid-range. They've been staving you off, removing things, dragging you into the late game. You get to 6 mana. At the point that you've gotten to 6 mana and you're struggling to put up an offense against them, yeah, you can cast Bother. You can make 3 flyers that can pressure them in the air, surveil 2 to get to the cards that you need. That's a pretty good play. It's not the play you were intending to make in the deck ever, but it's not a terrible fallback plan. If they've been just sweeping the board and trying to keep you off kilter, prevent you from pressuring them. I don't know if that means this card ever gets into a deck like that. I mean, just the prevalence of, Thalia being around. And then this makes Thopters, it doesn't make humans or soldiers or whatever. So it might not synergize well with your deck unless it's an artifact beatdown. But I'm saying this could be a reasonable tool, it's just an uncommon. Alright, that brings us to the end of White. So now I need to figure out what I'm going to be crafting. I think the Unyielding Gatekeeper is the kind of card that I might like for my White control deck. I got kind of a mid-range control thing. And I'm okay with playing a slower game, sweeping the board, and eventually setting up, my long-term creature presence, where I can flip this guy up, have a 3-power thing, get rid of something of the opponent's forever, or just save something of my own. And I've got a lot of ETB triggers in that deck. I think it'll do good work there. That same deck I was mentioning is also a 250 card pile. You may have seen an earlier iteration of it on this channel by the name of Ivory Tower. It has been updated and still sees play to this day. It always needs more sweepers. So, no witnesses. Yeah, it makes it in. Rare number 3, I'm going to do Case of the Uneaten Feast. And this is for my own personal preferences. I think a life gain deck sounds like fun. I've had a lot of fun with white-black life gain decks over many years. It's one of my favorite archetypes back when I played Duels of the Planeswalkers. I think this is a good, strong card with a crazy effect if you've solved the case. So yeah, I'm happy to get the 3rd copy of it. My Mythic is between Delny and Aurelia's Vindicator. And I know I'm a contrarian. I know so many people love Delny and they love the things that it can do for their deck building applications. For the kinds of decks that I like to play, that I like to build, like this kind of slow controlling white mid-range control deck of mine, I think I'm willing to test a copy of Aurelia's Vindicator in that deck. I could see it regrowing a bunch of stuff out of the graveyard for me. So, yeah, for my own play style, and this is part of the important bit with the deck building toolbox, is to know yourself. For my playstyle, I think I might get more value out of this card than I do out of Delny. There's also an outside chance it could see play in a life gain deck for its lifelink. Alright, let's craft it up. Alright, join me next time when I talk about blue. And we will continue this series on until we end at multicolor. Like and subscribe. Please check out my other videos. That's the big one. And until next time, never stop honing your critical thinking and empathy.